$1.5 trillion. That's a conversation at the global stage. And how much of that is Africa getting or the global south getting? $100 billion, basically, not even a tenth of the investments. On this episode, we're going to be breaking down to you why it's important to have the conversation around climate finance, in particular, the second objective of the Climate Summit, which is the pathway to a new global finance deal, and why we need to have that conversation. My name is Stella Bugonko, the CEO of Jacob's Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa. So let's start with a little bit of history so that we're able to understand where we are. They say that if you don't understand where you're coming from, you probably don't even know where you are or where you're going. So let's start with where this whole thing started from and why this conversation around climate finance is so needful and timely right now, and why Africa needs to have a very strong position about it. And not just Africa, the developing nations. In 1944, there was a need to reconstruct the world because everything was in shambles. And that's when a meeting was held in Bretton Woods, and an organization called the World Bank was formed, and the UN was also formed around the same time. There were a handful of nations at the time. In fact, if you are an African country, you were not existing as a country at the time. You had not attained your independence at that time. So basically, you were not part of the conversation. You were not in consideration of the conversation when the World Bank was being formed and when the UN was being formed. So fast forward, this is a couple of years later, and we're still having the same structure of the UN and structure of the World Bank as it was formed those many years ago. And so many years later, we find ourselves in a place where countries have developed. All the countries in Africa are sovereign states, 55 of them. And there are many other developing countries that have come up. And right now we are over 190 countries. And we are still using the same structure of financing globally, especially around development. That's where the problem is, because right now there's a push around decarbonizing, a push around resilience, a push around all the countries to put in place measures around energy, around agriculture, to make sure that we are developing in a more sustainable way into the future. But this is where the problem is, because Africa is still developing, and many of the global south countries are still developing, which means they rely a lot on aid. And I won't go into the details of the financing pact. We will definitely delve into that in a separate forum. But at the moment, what we need to understand is the current development finance structure is set up in a way that many of the developing countries rely on aid and support from the developed nations, and of course the DFIs, those are the IMFs and the World Banks, to loan to these countries. But at the same time, there's a push around decarbonizing. How do we do that? There's a school of thought that we do not need to separate development from resilience in terms of resilient development or the normal things. And to break it down for us to understand, on the one hand, we need to develop and we need to have schools and hospitals and build the bridges and the roads that need to be there for us to develop. But on the other hand, there's a sudden push and an insistence, especially around the energy space, for many of the African countries to go green. Let me give an example. In Uganda, they've been in the process of developing an oil pipeline based on the oil that they discovered and intend to use to develop. But there's been a sudden push from the European countries and developed countries to reduce the investment that comes into similar projects or such projects that have to do with fossil fuels, and a push towards renewable energy. And it's understandable, but there is that contention around, do we stop the process of development in terms of, like using fossil fuels, like we mentioned in a previous episode, like Ghana, for example, that discovered oil? Do we stop that exploration of oil that would be beneficial to the economy and begin to focus on renewable energy? Or do we begin to have in place a system that is systematically and in a systematic way moving the transition away from fossil fuels into renewable energy? How long will that take? Who will invest in that? There are many questions around that. So back to the pact or the new global finance deal and why that's a major point for the African Climate Summit. So in COP27 last year, there was an idea that was fronted and championed by Prime Minister Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, that is called the Bridgetown Initiative. The Bridgetown Initiative, simply put for now, is basically a push around, can we restructure the World Bank? And can we restructure this Bretton Woods institutions? And that's, like I said, the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF, to be able to be relevant to where we are right now as a globe. Instead of using what was developed in 1944 to still be serving a nation or nations that have significantly changed. The balance of power globally has also changed. So how can we get, for example, the African nations and the developing nations at the table when conversations are being held around aid, for example? And for those who need to know just a little bit, just to make sure that you understand a bit more, many of the developing countries borrow at 8%, 8 times much more in terms of interest rates compared to the developed countries. That's why the Bretton Woods institutions need to be restructured. And so back to COP27, the initiative, the Bridgetown Initiative was, can we get this restructuring process begun? And so President Macron of France offered to host an event in the course of the year before the next COP to break down what that would look like. And that meeting was held in June this year, an amazing meeting where African and especially the Global South came together and different countries came together to put their minds around how does a new financing pact or financing deal look like? How do you begin to finance the development that is required? Because, for example, and this is an example that the Prime Minister gave, Prime Minister Mia Mottley gave both at COP27 and keeps referring it every single time. Whenever there's a flood, for example, in one of those island states, they start from scratch. And yet they still have debt to pay. So how do you begin to rebuild your country while you're still paying for the debt that you took, that you used to build your country, but has been swept away because of floods or hurricanes or whatever natural disaster that happens because of climate? That's why there's a need to have a conversation around the issues of climate finance. So the outcome of the meeting held in Paris was beautiful. Amazing ideas that came out of it. Like I mentioned, there was tax proposals on larger emitters. Basically, if you emit carbon, you should pay for the tax. You should be taxed for that. And then that should go into a fund that can then be used to help in terms of the development that is required, a more resilient development that is required. There were other proposals, for example, to pause the whole idea of debt repayment for a certain period of time. And then, of course, the major push is around, can we restructure the payments to make them make sense and not favor a certain part of the world over the others? Amazing proposals. And like I said, please do read the report to get final details, but we will break it down for you in a separate episode. And so that was the outcome of the June meeting. But there was still a feeling of, we still need to refine this further to say this is our position as an African continent. And that's the brilliance, one of the brilliant reasons why the African Climate Summit makes so much sense, especially at this time, because the output of that meeting becomes a major part of the conversation at the Africa Climate Summit. And I believe that the conversation is not just about aid. It's not just about help. It's not just about saying loss and damage, which is great and needful, but it's a small portion of what is required to be able to actually move the needle when it comes to global decarbonization and Africa's role in that respect. And so this new finance pact that is global but now going to be domesticated around the African position is one of the reasons that the African leaders are gathering in Nairobi on the 4th to the 6th of September 2023. And the idea is, can we table at G20? Can we table at UNGA? Can we table at COP28 our own position to say, these are the ideas that we are coming up with, to say this is how we need the financing structure to happen, and are the proposals that we are putting or fronting as far as restructuring the global financial scene to enable development to happen. And from someone who's worked in government and knows how needful it is to make sure that finances actually flow to the lowest part of the government, in our case in Kenya, the county governments, there's need to make sure that we have enough sources of development or sources of revenue as a country. And we cannot do that if there's a push between developing and going green. There has to be a creative way of doing that, and we cannot forgo one for the other. We cannot stop building hospitals so that we can, put up renewable energy projects, for example. There's need for different kinds and innovative ways of addressing the needful finance that is required for the global South countries to develop. And that's one of the outcomes of the Africa Climate Summit. Thank you so much for listening. That was a breakdown of the second objective of the Africa Climate Summit, which is a new pact for global finance that's needful, like I said, and very timely. And in the next episode, we're going to be breaking down for you the third objective. So stay tuned for that. And the third objective has to do with what are some of the things that are going to be announced. Because one of the approaches of the summit is enough talk, let's get to action. And that's what they're going to be doing, announcing the major deals that are going to be signed at the Africa Climate Summit. We'll get to discuss that as the third objective in the next episode, so stay tuned for that. Please do engage with us and send us your feedback, your comments. What are your views on global finance? What are your views on the report once you've read it? Share your input, because while the conversations are happening at the global stage, and even in these meetings in boardrooms and conferences, it's the average African that actually matters. Your voice matters, your view matters, and I hope that especially for young people, you can lend your voice and contribute your views that are absolutely needful in our comment section below, and we'll try and highlight them in future episodes. My name is Sela Bogonko, and I'm the CEO of Jacob's Ladder, and you've been watching Green Jobs Africa.